Hi, welcome to the latest episode of Spirit in the Material World. I'm your hostess, Jana Zinzi, also known as Jazz, and I'm super excited to be here with Dr. Nicole. That's what I'm calling you, Dr. Nicole,
Take it.
the amazing travel foodie influencer blogger, just a really dope spirit. And if you've been on Instagram and you like food, that voice, "Hey foodie friends," puts you putting you on to the best food in New Orleans through Eaton Path NOLA.
That's right.
It is. So welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you for being here today.
Of course.
Um, so I would love to know just a little bit more. Tell the folks how you got into your, travel and food blogging. I'm new to New Orleans, so I just love your content. It's been a guide. Like all the time, I'm like, save post, save post. Okay, wait, send to my friend. Hey, girl, we got to go here. So yeah, tell me a little bit more about how you got into this.
Absolutely. So I've been in New Orleans for about 10 years now. And so I really started when I moved here. I was, new to the city. I had always loved the city, like knew this is where I wanted to live. But, was new and exploring and was basically trying to find a way to just keep track for myself, like where I was eating, what I liked, what I was doing, what I enjoyed, and a way to stop bothering like friends and family who weren't in the city and like bombarding them with my food pictures and bombarding my personal feed with like nothing but food pictures. So, um, that's how it started, like just simply like a way to track and remember places that I liked, places that I tried. And from the start, I think it brought up this like deep passion for food and culture that I knew I had. Like it had always been there, but when you find yourself doing something you really really like, and then all of a sudden everyone else is like, this, like you do this so well, like we want more of it, like little things like that used to happen, so and still happen. So I can remember even just like the first 3 months of starting, and it was like a Tumblr back then, like because
Hmm.
I like easy things, and someone was like, oh, Tumblr's easy, you just upload a picture and like a quick caption. And Instagram was still kind of new, so I was like, okay, yeah, I'll do a Tumblr. So even just like a couple months in, I was asked to like write for Invade NOLA, which I'm not sure if they're still around, but it was like a local kind of zine that had like a food section. They eventually had a book. I had like a chapter in the book. So I just started getting kind of connected, and different opportunities were opening up around like food and culture, and writing and tracking it in the city. Um, but yeah, like in short, it was just a way for me to track. And then other people became interested in it and were like asking me for advice and questions. And I've always been a really curious person. So I always am like really deeply, deeply, deeply invested and interested in getting to know the place that I am. And in New Orleans, as you know, food is so deeply tied to our culture and our history, right? And so it was just like a natural way to get to know the city and also like uplift it in some ways.
That's one of the things I actually really appreciate about what you do. The distinction that you always, it's not just like, hey, this food is delicious. Oh my God, go get this drink. You always offer some reflection of the culture.
Mhm.
And particularly going to different like ethnic quote unquote cuisines,
Yep.
of different communities here, which I love because I always learn something about one, the history of like rice. It'll be that, and or something about the culture of how it's really tied to New Orleans. And I think that's something that's really unique and really cool about what you're doing here and what you do with food blogging. So I just want to big you up for that because I that's really what was like made me be like, oh, I want to keep following this
Yeah.
information. So always appreciating like the education about culture. and history. I think it's important as like travelers, as and also too, even as just like transplants. I mean, you've been here 10 years. I'm very new. Um, but I think it's really dope. So I love to
Yeah.
see that.
Yeah, and I do too, and I think, I've always been a lover of history. My undergraduate major was in history. Before I was like, history? I'm like, yeah, I love history. And particularly in college, started to like unlearn a lot of the problematic history that we're taught in K-12, right? Like, wait a minute, I've been lied to. And started learning more about like Black and Brown history and legacies in this country. And I think to your comment around like, being an intentional traveler in some ways, I think that's such an easy lift for all of us to do, right? Like, look up the
Yep,
history of the place that you're going. And like specifically like the critical history, right? Like the history from the quote unquote bottom up. Um, and it's such an easy, simple like task, I think, to just get to know place and where you are and honoring like the, Black, Indigenous, and communities of color that have been there and that have likely contributed to the entire culture of that place, right? So,
exactly.
yeah. So I appreciate you for appreciating it because
Yeah, no, I think that that's important to be in community, and also I think being working in travel, being travel writers, bloggers, influencers, that it's important for us to model that.
yep.
And so, to that point, I'm wondering, do you have tips or tricks that you suggest for travelers on how to do some of that research? Because I wonder sometimes if folks don't know, and also they may not know if the history that they're getting is solid, like kind of through what lens it's from. So I'm just curious if there's things that you've done, in your own research that might be helpful to our audience.
Yeah. One of the things I do is just like really explicit Google searches. Like, you know, so like indigenous. So last November, we were in Utah for a family trip to some national parks in Utah. And so my husband and I committed to like specifically looking up indigenous history of Utah. And so we got a couple of books, we watched a couple of YouTube videos to like really understand the people of that place and what happened to
Mhm.
them and what they're doing now and ways that we can even support. So I remember finding like a couple of nonprofits there and donating. So I think those are I think simple ways like do a critical Google search like indigenous history of New Orleans, Black history of New Orleans. Like, really, that's what I search. I
Yeah.
sometimes even do like, if I'm posting about a cocktail or something, my explicit Google search is like Black history of mixologists. Like, it's all there. It's just like, if you don't put the like particular identity or community first, it's unfortunately not the first thing Google is going to pull up. So I'm like, just use your keywords well. And then I think another step, like if you're able to, is like going back to the example around Utah, is also doing some vetting of like, local organizations or communities there that might be accepting donations. And commit to, all right, let's donate, $200 and spread it across maybe 3 organizations, right? Like a drop in the bucket based on how much you might be spending on the whole trip, right? But it's still some kind of commitment and honoring of like the place and the people that are there. So those would be my tips. And I just always say to like just question all the information you're receiving and like do a counter search. Like, okay, you can read the history of New Orleans, but now Google search, like I said, Black history of New Orleans, and do your own kind of compare and contrast.
I love that. I think that's really important. One of the things that I think about and talk about a lot is media literacy.
Mm,
And that's exactly what that is like, basically knowing where you're getting your information
yeah.
from, questioning the sources. And that was one of the things, like, you and I have talked about that in terms of, starting WanderWomxn, is like, reading a lot of different blogs and not being able to like see ourselves
Yeah.
represented. And also, just knowing who history is told through, how history is propagated, and wanting to be conduits for, like the people's history, right?
Mhm.
Particularly, like you said, Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. So I super dig that. And one of the things that just was coming to me, that one in terms of what I've noticed from your work, and then also too as you were talking, it is Latinx Heritage Month or Hispanic Heritage Month. And what I really appreciate about your framing is that there is a centering of like Black and
Mhm.
Indigenous um, communities.
Mhm.
And I know that that can be, an issue, I think, sometimes in terms of like anti-Blackness and, you know, and that's something that is an interesting conversation that's happening. So I'm curious about just like if you have any offerings for folks in terms of that piece of their research, or like what that connection has been for you, especially being in a place like New Orleans, which is like
Mhm.
such a Black city.
Yeah. Yeah, I think particularly as it's connected to like Latinx communities, I'm Cuban American. I'm mixed race. So like my mom's side of the family is from Cuba. They're a mix of like Afro-Cuban and like Spanish, right? And my dad is white from the US. So I say that because all of that matters, right? Like our identities matter with how they give us lenses to look through things and interrogate things. And
Hmm.
I think sometimes, I think often, like in communities of color, there is rampant anti-Blackness, right? Like how many of us who are not Black learned to succeed was by drinking the poison that the colonizer was giving us, which was telling us all of these negative things about our Black communities, right? And so I think for those of us in the Latinx community in particular, like you really have to sit with that. Like where notions of like good hair come from, or like upholding the race, like where does all of that come from? That comes from anti-Blackness. And I think coupled with like interrogating messages you may have received like growing up or things that you saw in the media or what have you, like also, again, like doing your own research or Googling around the Black history that does show up in Latinx communities. Like, again, most of the culture in Caribbean and Latin American communities are 100% tied to Black and Indigenous people, right? And like Latin America and the Caribbean are also interesting places where a whole lot of like racial mixing happened.
Yep.
And sometimes that leads to like whitewashing of some, like, oh, well, we're just everything. We're all mixed. Like, there's no issues here. We're all one race. And it's like,
Hmm.
and when you do that, you're still erasing Blackness and indigeneity. And so, like, do some Googling, like, look up where salsa music came from, look up where like barbecuing came from. And you'll start to see the deep connections between like, Black and Indigenous communities in our culture, music, like the beats, the how things are prepared, even ingredients. I remember several years ago, a friend of mine, she's Nigerian and Ghanaian. It was like the first time I had this, like, wait a minute, we eat the same food. Like, you eat plantains, I eat plantains. You eat yuca, I eat yuca. Like, you prepare things like lots of stews and one pot meals. We do that too. Like, you eat oxtails, I eat oxtails. And I was like, wait a minute. And that's what kind of kicked off a lot of my research on, like, oh, yeah, this comes from a people, right? That we are not often uplifting and naming. And we do it
Hmm.
for like the United States too, right? Like all the countries do it, but I think yeah, just like doing your own research, and also like sometimes you have to sit in your shit and interrogate like these messages that you've received or these thoughts that pop into your mind that are like, these are harmful, not productive, and are not going to move forward any of our agendas as communities of color to have a more equitable and inclusive space where we all can belong.
Hmm.
So that's what I think about a lot to like push myself forward, and I try and model that. I make mistakes all the time, all the time, all the time, all the time. But I try and model that as much as I can on my page by like uplifting the stories and things that you've named.
Thank you so much for offering that, and I super appreciate that. It's something that I think about a lot too, in terms of internalized anti-blackness.
Absolutely.
I'm a Black biracial woman, and my background is I am adopted, but my birth father is Haitian. And
Mm,
so it's so interesting learning more about, like, these conversations are popping up about, is if you're Haitian, are you Latino or
yes.
Latinx, right? And so I've just been like, I never thought about that.
Yeah.
To me, it was never a thing at all. And the funny thing is, if we're going to talk about identity, growing up in New York, I'm also like half Italian, so it's like that's the biracial piece.
Yeah.
And so growing up in New York, everybody thought my whole life I was Puerto Rican. It does not matter where I go, what I do. People here have asked me if I'm Puerto Rican. People in Mexico ask me if I'm Puerto Rican. People in Costa Rica ask me if I'm Puerto Rican. And I'm like, no, by default, like honorary, sure, maybe just like growing up in New York, you know what I'm saying? But like, no. And it's funny though, because there's an image of what that looks like, right? Of what a Puerto Rican person looks like,
Yes.
and even if you take it to like the J Lo, which is more, fair and,
Yes.
like more like a whiter type of features with it's just so interesting, these conversations and how they bring up, colorism, the history of Haiti and like DR.
Mhm.
There's just been some really interesting conversations about what actually is Latinx. And so I love seeing how it is bringing up the broader conversations of anti-Blackness within Latinx communities. And also, I think there's something really beautiful about making these connections differently,
Mhm.
um, with like spitting historical facts and like what these terms mean. Like, what does Latinx mean? What does Hispanic mean? And like the language that is used around identity, race, and who decided these words.
Correct. Yeah.
Like what those, to your point, what those images are for people, for all of us. What we've been fed is, oh, this is a Latino. You know what I mean? And so, even so, like, I remember too in high school, I have one of my homegirls. She's still one of my best friends in the whole world. Shout out to Melissa if you're watching. But
Hey, Lisa.
right. So she's Panamanian, and so
Mm,
in high school she would be like, "I'm Black," and I'd be like, "Yeah, but you're Panamanian too," and she'd be like, "Yeah, but I'm Black." And so it took me a minute. It took me years until I finally like really understood what she was saying, and I'm like, "Oh, duh," And it was my own very narrow idea and like education miseducation of how you put people in
yeah.
boxes based on country of
Yeah.
origin.
We love boxes, and if you study like brain science, like the science of the brain, um, our brain is actually kind of lazy. Like our brain is super lazy. So like once we learn about a box or a category, we're like, bet that's the box and category. And that's where and this is where biases come from, right? Because we're like, our brain's like sorting and it's like, oh, this goes here, this goes here, da, da, da. Okay, easy, I can rest. So yeah, you do have to constantly like interrogate and push yourself because your brain is just naturally going to funnel things in like easy ways. But those boxes and categories don't allow people to be the complex humans that we really are, right? Like you can be Black and Panamanian. You can be
Right.
biracial from like two totally different ethnicities, right? Like all of these things. Um, it's just it makes our brain spin a little bit harder than it
Mhm.
normally does, but it also opens up this beautiful world where you're able to see people for like the full beings that they are and like let them just be them, whatever that means, right? So
and
yeah.
and I think that's part of like our own
Yeah.
decolonization, like that internal, where you said like we're just sitting with our own nonsense, the stuff that we've learned, the stuff that we've internalized, what we've been told about all sorts of different things, hair and certain cultures and there's
Oh,
spirituality, like
yes.
there's so many different things, and for me, I think one of the things that we share is this love of these diaspora
Mhm.
connections, right?
Yes.
Like finding more and more ways in which we're connected, in which
Yes.
we're in community, which I always say, I'm like, oh, we're country cousins, you know what I mean? And even though this is different, I love this story of when I was in Vietnam. I was on this train ride, and they had a guy with a food car, and he had some mango. So I was like, yeah, I'm gonna get this mango. I'm hungry on this train, and I know I could eat mango. It's not gonna make me sick or anything. So I get this mango, and he gives me this little packet, and it had like salt, like chili salt. And
Oh,
I was like, yo, they got
right.
tahini in Vietnam.
I know.
you know so it just like blew my mind. And so it's like those kinds of things is like understanding, like we are all country cousins, we all have these different you know ways in which we are um expressing that based on like kind of where our people
Yep.
landed, and who colonized who, and who migrated where, and what was mixing, but how beautiful it is that these like ancestral roots are just always showing up for us in all of these ways. And I feel like especially in these times, this is when it's important for us to really know about these connections, because
Mhm.
things are so divisive.
Mhm.
And also because there's so much travel going on, that it's like my, Aquarian hope and dream that these are ways to just continue to expand the conversation, expand our minds, do that decolonizing work, see those connections amongst each other,
Yep.
and like create more a global community of folks. So
I'm here for it. I love it. I love it. I love it.
yeah. So tell me, well, let's get back to food for a
Okay.
second. I would love to know, for people who want to visit New Orleans, because you are a foodie
Don't ask me a
concierge.
question. What are you going to ask me? Are you about to ask me my favorites?
I won't ask you your favorites. I won't ask you that. But since I know that you do,
No harm.
planning for folks that want to come to New
Yes.
Orleans, if you had to pick, I'll give you three things,
Lordy.
because one is hard, that people should try when they come to New Orleans. What would you say?
Okay. Um, I would say, so I'm categorizing this, since you gave me three, into like some of our largest populations in the city. So that's the route I'm going to go for this. So of course, so I won't give like specific names of places you should go, but like categories you should search. So our three, I hope I'm right on this. I think I'm right. Our three biggest populations in New Orleans are, of course, Black, right? Black African American is over 60% of our city. And then a really growing Latinx population, specifically Hondurans, more specifically Garifuna, which are the Afro Hondurans. And I think Belize as well. Garifuna kind of span a certain area. And then Vietnamese. So
Yeah.
I would say, and I should have mentioned this earlier when I was giving my tips, like once you kind of figure out the populations of the place you're going, like go support those businesses and go eat at those places, right? So and there's, tons of lists that you can find, like, our top Black owned restaurants, Latinx, Honduran owned, and Vietnamese, and do some exploring around that. And then also Google like the connections between those three communities and food culture in this city, because those are also rampant and deeply connected. You mentioned Haitian. I mean, we have such a strong, strong connection to Haiti in this city,
Mm.
and Afro Cubans. Like there was all kinds of organizing between Haitians and Afro Cubans, back in the day in the Treme, actually. So, anyway, that's what I would say. Like, bucket your research into like those three categories. And I mean, you could just stick with those categories and literally book your entire trip and have a delicious time. So yeah, that's what I would say.
I love that. That is an excellent recommendation. And I'm like, oh, I need to do this research about Haitian and Afro-Cuban organizing in Treme.
Yes,
Um,
it's deep. It's really deep. I'm gonna try and remember the book. Um, And I have some articles too, but yeah, I'll send it your way.
That'd be great. That'd be great. That's one thing about New Orleans is I feel like it's just like layers and layers and layers because of the migration
Yep.
patterns, because of what this city being a port city, but also like a city where folks could come as a haven for a lot in a lot of ways, right? Whether you were like a freak artist, whether you're like escaping a revolution, all sorts of different things, which is what is really like powerful and amazing. One of many things that's incredible about this city, as well.
And what
And then
I think, oh, sorry, one thing.
no, please continue.
You've got me thinking because I think what's even like more interesting to add on to the things that you shared is that New Orleans was like that even before it was New Orleans. So I've gone on a couple of, I would recommend this for folks too. There's these Bulbancha indigenous walking tours of New Orleans. Bulbancha is the indigenous word for name for New Orleans. Get roughly translates to like land of many tongues. And even for our indigenous communities, like this was the gathering and meeting place. Like this was the trade place. This is where you met up to do things. Like it was always a bustling, like mixing of people and practices and trade, even pre-colonization. So it's really like deeply embedded in our soil, which I think is really beautiful to think about too.
Thank you for sharing that. I love that. And I'm like, I want to go on those walking tours like ASAP. I'm going to Google that. I have my list of things to Google after our
I
conversation.
love Googling things. You should
Yes,
Google
yes.
things.
There it is. Um, what was I gonna ask you?
Oh,
I'm
yes, I'm
so
sorry, I cut you
yeah.
off.
No, 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 no. That was very important to include. So I'm grateful for that because yeah, I think or I definitely want to know more about the indigenous roots here, especially because some of my orientation is through like Mardi Gras Indians and understanding
Yep,
that beautiful connection between um, Black folks, who were like enslaved Africans and the indigenous tribes that were here
yep.
and what, community building looked like. Um, so I'm super into this. What I was going to
Mhm.
ask is for the folks out there who maybe are aspiring food bloggers looking to, get more into like food writing or, doing like food vlogging. Do you have any tips, tricks, words of wisdom and advice that you can share?
Yeah, absolutely. Number one, and I this for fear of sounding like trite or contrite, I never know how to use those words. But to be yourself, like honestly, if you are able to find your own voice, like people are just drawn to that, right? Like not everyone's going to love your particular voice, like, and that's okay. But I think we're all naturally drawn to people that are, well, I'll speak to myself. I love being around people that are themselves. Even if it's like, I don't really dig the thing that you're really into, but I love that you're like so into it and that it allows you to be like your full and authentic self. Like, I love that for you, So I think finding your voice and, being as authentic as you can be on your platform, like people are drawn to that. Um, and like logistically speaking, I think get on a schedule. Like for
Mm,
me, my like planning time and posting time is usually early morning when things are just, quieter in my household. But I think like consistency in your planning is going to help you in the long run. Because, especially if you're going to launch your work on a social media platform, those social media platforms and algorithms love consistency. So they love like, a daily post or a 3 times a week post that happens at the same time, right? And also like your audience is able to like expect, a regular recurring message from you.
mhm,
Um, and then I think too, like build a lot of my success I think is just through like building community and connections. So I think and being curious. So I think too, like, get out of your own bubble, like talk to people, get to know them, like particularly around food stuff. I'm like, if I can talk to the chef or owner or, whomever inspired this vision and like understand more about their why, like that's so interesting to me. Right. And I think it also, in me being able to share that story, it allows folks to even build like a deeper connection with the business in some way. Right. So if I was bucketing it in three things, like, being authentic, finding your voice, logistically speaking, finding your like planning, thinking, posting time, because this takes a lot of time.
Okay.
And then not being afraid to build connections and build community. Like that's what this is all supposed to be about. So, asking questions, talking to folks, I think all helps to strengthen, what comes out in your platform too.
That is great advice. That is great advice. The macro and then the micro of like the
Oh
consistency
my gosh,
and those tips.
and don't be
So
afraid to give yourself a break too. Like sometimes I'm like, it's just not happening for 2 days. Like it's just not happening.
yes, yes, it is and it's real talk. It does take a lot of time.
Yes.
Um, like a 30-second reel is
Yes.
a lot. Um,
Yep.
so I feel better too when I hear people say that because I'm like, is it just me that is
No,
like,
it's not just you. It is not
oh my
just you.
god,
This takes so much time.
yep,
So much time. But I really enjoy it and it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time.
same. It's like both and multiple
Yeah.
truths are happening at the same time. Yep, totally. Dr. Nicole Caridad, you are a gem. You are a
Aw,
gem. Thank you so much for being here. Can you let the folks know how they can find you, where, how, all the socials, all the info?
absolutely. Okay, you can find me on Instagram and TikTok as at Eaton Path NOLA. So Eaton like EATEN, like beaten path, but Eaton Path. And then Facebook, I'm off the Eaton Path NOLA. And then I also have a website, eatonpathnola.com, where you can see my like monthly favorites on there. You can get in touch with me. And if you're interested in like a curated foodie experience of the city, you can also contact me for that, concierge service as well. And yeah, and I love talking to the people. So like DM me, like if you have recs for me, I love to hear recs. If you have questions for me, like people will frantically DM me, like, I'm gonna be in mid city on Saturday, like where should I eat? Like I love helping out with stuff like that. So feel free to send me some messages and connect.
I love it. Duly noted. You're great with the food recs. So I hope folks will take advantage and check out all that you're offering, especially folks who are coming from out of town. Definitely
Yes,
connect with Dr. Nicole. You will be very pleased. Your belly will be full and happy.
yes. We can
So
guarantee that. That's for sure.
that's right. Well, thank you again for being here. This is Spirit in the Material World. I am so happy to be here, and I will see you all soon. Make sure to find us at wanderwomentravels.com, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.